So good to see you. We're going to give folks just a minute to arrive in the Zoom room, and then we're going to dive into our first of two test runs of the draft rules. Very excited about today, and I hope you all are as well.
Okay, sorry. Hi. Hi everybody. I'm gonna share the presentation. Every single time I do this, I'm like, where is this button? How are you guys all doing? Been a while. I think,
Very good.
like I
Good.
said in the email, I think this is kind of the fun part. We get to dig in now and really see if and how this program works and do some real life tryouts. I did want to acknowledge that I think I didn't link the right version of the rules in the packet, and I will send that all out to you after this meeting. I think it should also be, well, yeah, it would have gone out in the RAC packet, which is public, and you can find that on the website if you want to look at it before I send it out this afternoon. But also, that is not actually going to be the focus of this conversation, so it's not really critical to have that up in front of you. But we definitely want you to look it over and have some, yeah, give
We
back to
are
us. Yeah.
only seeing a black screen. Is that what we're supposed to be seeing?
How about I drive the screen sharing?
Go for it, Sean. I'm
Yeah, that
stopping.
might help. That might help.
Thanks for letting
Um,
me know, Cadence. All
all
right,
right.
here we go. Thanks, John. So we're gonna start again, just acknowledging that we are working from the racial equity framework for decision making, and as we always do, just make sure that these elements are sort of front of mind as we're working through the rules and ensuring that we're considering the impacts to marginalized communities and protected classes in the development of these rules. I've highlighted sort of the 4 areas that I think are really, particularly critical in this part of the project. But as always, all of these touch, crossover, intersect, and so I just want to make sure that we start with this in mind, and then we can move on to the next slide. I wanted to give you all a sense of where we're at in the process. Some of you have been following along, but it's kind of complicated. So we're getting close. We just filed the Secretary of State notice. Was it 2 weeks ago, Sean? Something like that. It's blurring. So that was the version 3 rules that were filed. And then there's a little bit of a process before the rules are finally adopted on December 5th. We have one more HOTAC meeting, which will be this a similar sort of project as we're doing in this, a similar exercise as we're doing in this meeting, but we'll drill down on referral and what that actually looks like. There is a public hearing with LCDC on October 25th. And this is the place to ensure that your comments are filed in the record. So that's an important date for folks to remember and to share. There's a RAC meeting on November 6th. Like I said, the LCDC adoption hearing will happen on December 5th and 6th. We're not exactly sure which date this item will appear on. Then there's a follow-up RAC meeting, December 9th, before the rules are finally effective, January 1st, 2025. I also wanted to note that, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, but I'm not sure, it's been a while. So in the next cycle, between this new year and next new year, the work of DLCD's sort of policy work on ONA will shift into a focus on developing adoption-ready policies, model codes, guidance, and sort of getting into developing out the substance of what these rules have developed the framework for. We are sort of thinking that what we propose to do is combine the HATAC and the NAPTAC, the Needs and Production Advisory Committee, into a combined work group to take on that set of work. And this is optional. So this is an invitation to you all who've been involved up till now, to continue to stay involved in that work. But understanding everybody is busy, it's also, it's not required, it's not an obligation. So, more to come on that, but I definitely wanted to let you know that that's on the horizon. I think that is all. Sean, is there anything else we needed to say here?
No, I think you nailed it.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
Is there an opportunity, maybe you said this, I missed it, for other folks not on those to jump into that process as well?
Good question.
Yeah, I don't think we actually have our colleagues are working on like the specific work plan, right? I don't think we have it was intended to be like an open process or an open invitation for the folks in the TAC to be able to work with us on adoption ready actions. And as part of that, we'll need to do like some outreach, right? Like we'll want to talk to people to calibrate policies effectively, all that kind of stuff. But we don't really know what that policy looks like because our colleagues are working on the plan, right? So we'll have more details in the coming weeks. But for now, I don't have an answer to that question.
I guess I would just say it's often been hard for me to get people with substantive knowledge and substantive interest to get involved in this very procedural discussion. And once things move over to a more substantive discussion, I think it will be possible for people to contemplate taking the time to engage more deeply.
It's helpful feedback, Michael. And yeah, I think even if it's not as part of that sort of work group, there will definitely be ways to engage and hear from folks. So, but we'll definitely let you know, and I'll keep that in mind for sure as we, as we sort of develop out that work plan. Okay, so rule updates. Sean, you can go to the next slide. There was not a whole lot in version 3 that changed, but there were a few significant pieces that I wanted to bring your attention to. One, in the referral process, we heard significant concern about the track into the referral program that relied on whether a city had undertaken a particular action in their HPS. So I don't have the citation in front of me. Hold on just a minute. It is right here. 0315 sections 1 and 2 clarify that there's an opportunity here for cities, if they find that a particular action is really infeasible or ineffective, there's an opportunity for them to request a replacement action that DLCD reviews and that they can pivot to. And this happens at the midpoint review. It's outlined pretty clearly in the section of rule that is actually not in the acceleration program rules. So that is actually in the HPS section. And I'm looking at the citation. I think it's moved around a little bit. So the citation I'm looking at is a little bit old. I think maybe 0250, but don't quote me on that. I will make sure to highlight that for you if you want to look it over. That was an important sort of point of flexibility that we heard folks call for, and happy to talk about that a little bit more for clarifying questions. We also added a prioritization element in the audit process that looks first at barriers to production that affect fair housing issues. This section, which is sub 5 in 0325, is also where we will develop out a few other areas of prioritization, including an element that I know is important to some of you all, about adoption ready policies. That language is not in there right now, but it will be in version 4. And there's also going to be a reference to prioritization of affordable housing within climate friendly areas there to ensure that there's a connection through to the CFAC rules. I finally wanted to just put a little highlight on some increased specificity of enforcement mechanisms within the enforcement area of the rule. We heard concern that there was a sort of a looseness to the LCDC enforcement order element of that rule. We had just sort of said LCDC can decide. However, we didn't really describe what that process was going to be. So what is in the rule now is more of a little bit. It's a short section, but it includes a bit of the process which has DLCD recommending a set of actions to LCDC. Those actions will always include the implementation of a model code. And then it may include other mechanisms and tools that are sort of more targeted to the nature of the non-compliance. And again, this is just for the enforcement, sort of that very end of the line. This is that backstop that is intended to sort of ensure that nobody ever gets there. But we needed to sort of make that a little bit sort of more specific in order to be powerful enough for people to communicate that. So I think that is all. Sean, is there anything you want to add here in terms of updates?
No.
Cool. Okay, happy to answer clarifying questions, but again, would kind of like to move to the next section to Sam, I see your hand. And so we can definitely take some time, but I want to leave time to get into the good stuff.
It's a quick one.
Yeah.
There was one section, it is on page 17. I think it's the end of the housing production structure, maybe. It is the delinquent actions. I think that in talking through with Michael, we understood what that meant, but I just wanted to check in, like, what is a delinquent action that the city would have to prioritize in its next HPS that did not already get it referred to the acceleration program?
Oh, is this in the very end, like housing acceleration and non-compliance with the housing acceleration agreement?
It is.
This is in the HPS rules.
This is in the HPS rules?
It's in, yeah, housing production structure 660-008-200, and it's number 3. Delinquent actions. The city must include any actions from the most recently adopted or amended housing production strategy which were not completed during the previous housing production strategy cycle.
Right. Okay, so I think I understand it. Okay, so what it's saying, so the rules at referral, when you refer a city for not taking an HPS action, it is for not adopting an HPS action that's included as part of your HPS, right? And that happens at the midpoint, right? Obviously, after the midpoint, there's 3 or 4 years until the next HPS. And what that rule is saying is if there are any you didn't do in there, you have to do them in the next 3 or 4 years in the first part of your HPS. Otherwise, you will be referred. essentially. So saying, all right, you get a little bit more time to do it, but if you don't by the midpoint, then that would be a referral.
Okay, thank you. That is essentially what we figured. I just wanted to confirm that because that was that was supposed to be an automatic referral. So I just wanted to make sure that
Right.
that I
Yeah.
did correctly. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's just to make sure that actions at the very end of the HPS cycle are not like discarded.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for that question, and happy to continue that conversation over email, or if you want to give us a call to dig into that a little bit more. I think we can move on, Sean.
Oh yeah. Yeah, great. So I think, with that, obviously, the LCDC will kind of be first introduced to the draft rules later this October. Definitely encourage, right? We still anticipate there's going to be refinements between, now and the next version and the version that LCDC eventually ends up adopting. So please, we encourage y'all to sign up for testimony, submit public comments to LCDC, all that good stuff. And of course, we're always available to kind of continue talking through. And ideally, with these test runs, right? If we can find any, potential refinements that can help solve any problems we identified, that would also be super helpful. That's kind of why we want to do these test cases. But let's start with it. So Thea and I, we did a little bit of work over the last couple of weeks to source a couple of real but anonymized barriers to production that we know are happening. And we wanted to kind of get these all together. We chose 3, and they were intended to kind of encompass different situations, some maybe being a little bit more political, some being more like, oh, there's elements that are inside and outside of a city's control, elements that emphasize fair housing. And we wanted to get like kind of a broad spread of different issues, kind of characterize them for you all, and then just really have a conversation about like, all right, now let's take this framework and the rule for the audit process and like what, we do when we identify a barrier, and let's play that out, right? Let's like look at let's look at the barrier, the information that we have relevant to it, and let's talk through then, all right, what does this mean then in terms of here are the potential options that's available to the city, and let's do that exercise of like, all right, is this within a city's control based on the kind of test that we set up in rule, and like, let's just apply these. I should note some caveats with this, right? We haven't done full audits for any of these particular barriers. These are things that we found with publicly available information in a relatively short amount of time. So we don't have all the information for a lot of these barriers. And you'll see that as we go through it. And we certainly haven't done the full things that would be part of an audit, like getting all the documentation, talking to developers and city staff, all the things that you would need to do to have a fully fleshed out audit. But it's still useful, and we can talk through the implications of like, all right, here's this barrier. Let's talk through what would be the appropriate things to ensure that, the program's effective. So I think before we dive in, I'm going to start with maybe just a reminder on the rule framework, but just any questions about the exercise that we're doing today, or, anything before we dive in? No? All right. Well then, yeah, I mean, feel free to ask questions as we get into it. And again, just keep in mind, so we did 3 barriers, and we have like, it's kind of like a broader but more shallow review of each of these barriers. So just keep that in mind as we go through it. We're not going to have all the information, so I'll just point that out. All right, so let's start on a reminder of what the rule framework is around audits. So, 0325 is the rule that kind of directs DLCD in like how we actually conduct audits. A lot of the things in the first part of the rule are like process, right? We publish notice, we have, a fact-finding period, we have a public comment period, we have these kind of processes essentially as ability for DLCD to gather information from, folks in the community, from city staff, essentially just to give us a full sense of the picture. And then once we get into about subsection 5, that's when we start actually talking about, all right, what are we going to produce in terms of what the audit actually comes up with in regards to development barriers, right? And subsection 5 pretty much says, all right, DLCD, you're going to prioritize fair housing issues. And later on in a future rule draft, we'll also indicate, all right, we're also going to pay attention to and consider whether a city adopted adoption-ready actions. And we're also going to pay attention to barriers in CFAs too. And then once we get into subsection 6, this is like, all right, DLCD, you're going to publish this audit of barriers. And for each barrier that you identify, you're going to try and essentially outline what the context is at the local, regional, and state level. Again, we didn't do a full audit here, so we don't have the full context for all of these. Just keep that in mind. But then we also provide a series of alternatives, like what are the potential things that could happen essentially to address this barrier, and provide alternatives for consideration. And of course, we also consider what has the city included in their adopted HPS, right? Do they maybe already have a solution geared up for this type of thing, right? And we present that out for the city, provides a series of options. And of course, the city can also propose some of their own if they want to, right? So they could say like, all right, we don't like any of these options, DLCD, here's our own that we think will work better and make sense with our context. And here's what that is. And then of course, subsection 7 gets into the determination of whether the kind of barriers and the things contributing to it are the consequence of things that are directly within the city's control. And the way that we define that in rule is essentially a 3-part test. The first one is that it's locally actionable. The city is able to do something about it, right? The second is that they have kind of reasonable capacity, right, to be able to implement a particular action with DLCD support. So if DLCD has the funding and support, and we provide all the funding and support, the city, still has reasonable capacity to be able to implement that. And of course, if it doesn't meet that 3-part test, then what we focus on is focusing on building capacity, right? So with that in mind, I'm going to move to talking about kind of the first issue. But before I do, I just want to maybe pause and see if there's any questions on that basic rule framework, anything that needs clarification before we dive in. And I know you guys are super familiar with this. This is just a reminder. All right. Let's start with the first one. So this is a real, again, anonymized issue of small home underproduction. This came to us from a community generally with kind of a less urbanized market. I'll provide some context around the situation that this particular city is in, but I won't name the city, right? Because I'm not here to try to point fingers or anything like that. But they're a less urban market, so they're not near, say, like a major metropolitan area, anything like that. They are a medium city, so they're between 10,000 and 25,000 in population, which means that they're subject to some state law requirements, but not all of them. So they're subject to like the accessory dwelling unit and duplex requirements under state law, but not under the other middle housing provisions. They have pretty limited planning staff, roughly about 5 full-time equivalent staff members, which for a city this size is not uncommon, but generally speaking, right, generally more limited than what you'd find in a larger or more well-resourced jurisdiction. And just something also to keep in mind about this city, this is a real problem, but this is a city that adopted a housing capacity analysis in 2020, but wasn't actually required to adopt a housing production strategy. So they don't have one, right? So just keep that in mind as we're talking about this particular example. The reason we chose this barrier is because it was one that was raised to us as like a very significant issue in their housing capacity analysis. If you look at all of these quotations that I'm showing down here, this is from their document. This is essentially like, all right, we see that we have this problem. We are not producing enough small homes for folks in our community, especially folks who either have lower incomes or folks who might be aging, or folks retail or tourism sector. We have a shortage of housing options that are smaller and less expensive for folks in these categories of things, right? And that is kind of corroborated with their production data. We do have their production data going back to 2018, divided by different housing types. And you can kind of see, generally speaking, that they have some degree of detached single unit dwellings, a couple of townhouses, duplexes, and ADUs, in manufactured housing. But then really, once you get into denser housing types like triplexes, quadplexes, or multi-unit development, none. There's zero, at least for the last 5 years of production. And this is pretty important because when you look at the total number of units that they're producing year over year, it's roughly about 1/5 of their total annualized production target, right? So pretty significant margin to kind of try and make up. Of course, obviously these production targets are aspirational, but right, you can kind of see it's like, yeah, it does seem like there's kind of a shortage of small homes in this particular community. Again, this isn't the full context. Like we haven't talked, sat down with city staff to talk through all the barriers, or we haven't talked to the development community. So we don't have the full picture here, but I just want to ask what questions folks might have about this particular context. What we did do is we did do a code audit. And I'll talk about that in the next slide, unless folks have questions. Okay, let's talk about the code audit. Again, we can always feel free to chime in questions, feel free to raise your hands. I'm trying to the best of my ability to like present some of the things that we uncovered. So if we were looking at this barrier, right, we would need to be looking at a variety of different places where the production of small homes might be inhibited. And there's going to be a lot of different areas that we look, right? We're going to want to talk to the development community. We're going to want to talk to city staff. We're going to want to look at a variety of different things that could be contributing to the problem that we're seeing on the ground. But one of the things that we probably always should be doing is a review of the code that the city has, the development code, and kind of look at the parameters and see what incentives might be driving some of the problems herein. So I essentially did that for this particular city. I went through the development code. They generally have about like 3 major zoning districts, kind of a low density zoning district, a small lot residential zoning district, and then a multi-unit zoning district. And they have a couple of, overlays. They have a couple of village residential zones, some smaller zones here and there. They also allow housing in their commercial zones. But for the most part, those are relatively small, kind of marginal. And for the most part, most development happens in one of those 3 major zones that I mentioned. And they actually do have a BLI that kind of shows all the buildable lands for these types of things. So I did kind of a cross-reference to kind of look at, all right, well, what can you build in different amounts of the city's BLI? And if you kind of look at the provisions that exist in their zoning code, starting with single unit detached dwellings, they actually have a pretty forward code in terms of being fairly permissive with single unit detached dwellings. Even their low density zone allows a maximum dwelling unit of about 10 dwelling units an acre. That's about 1 home for every 4,500 square feet. And then when you look into their small unit dwelling zoning district, as well as the multi-unit dwelling district, they allow higher densities up to about 20 dwelling units an acre, which is about 1 home for every 2,200 square feet. And it's generally allowed by right. There's 2 off-street parking spaces per dwelling unit, but there aren't design standards. And of course, right, you can obviously divide these and sell the units fee simple. And because, the zoning code is fairly permissive for detached single unit dwellings, under state law, it's also, generally speaking, fairly permissive for ADUs and duplexes, right? So ADUs are allowed on all the same lots that single unit dwellings are, as well as duplexes. And duplexes, theoretically, because they're allowed on each lot or parcel that allows a single family detached home, hypothetically can hit double the density, right? So roughly 1 home for every 1,000 square feet. I think realistically, it's unlikely that a duplex will actually hit that density, especially because they apply parking requirements, which, a parking space is about 200 square feet, which is a fifth of 1,000, like 1,000 square foot lot, right? So realistically, probably not going to hit 40 dwelling units an acre, but you could conceivably see around like 25, 30. It kind of depends on the development characteristics, the site, all that type of stuff. And these are all dwelling types that are allowed by right. Once you start getting into townhouses, this is where it starts getting a little bit more tricky. The first thing that they do is they apply a heightened threshold of review. So they require it to undergo a public hearing by a planning commission. They generally have more requirements for things like off-street parking, that type of stuff. But you can achieve, roughly about the same density that you could for detached single-family dwellings, maybe a little bit higher. And they kind of restrict the amount of lands that townhouses are built on. But, it's still conceivable that you can build it. Once you start getting into triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, and multi-unit development, that's where things start getting pretty interesting, because this particular city is not required to comply with Division 46, right? They're a medium city. Because of that, the city kind of voluntarily underwent an effort to legalize these different housing types, but just legalize them using their multi-unit standards. And what that means is essentially they applied all the same standards that applied to multi-unit developments. And sometimes they actually applied more like requirements to specific housing types, like cottage clusters. So for all of them, they pretty much, in every zone, they limited it to the same density that you could achieve for single unit detached dwellings. And they required kind of a type 2 review. They applied the same height restrictions. They required generally a pretty significant amount of off-street parking. And then they had some pretty substantial multi-unit design standards, things like open space requirements, private open space requirements, lighting standards, different articulation standards, all these different kind of provisions that went into the review of multi-units. And then for cottage clusters, they even stacked on an additional set that required like 500 square feet of private open space per cottage cluster unit, and you were limited in the number that you could build, all these different types of things. And of course, you couldn't sell these fee simple, right? For the most part, you would have to condominiumize them if you wanted to actually sell the units. The exception to that is kind of cottage clusters. They had their own little land division pathway for them. But again, the trade-off is you had to build all these kind of other additional parameters around that. And so this is a pretty important set of incentives here, right? Like you can see that like for the most part, the code makes a lot of sense for a lot of things in single unit detached, ADUs, duplexes, that type of thing. But once you start getting into the kind of higher density housing types, including in their high density zone where they kind of restrict these types, other housing types, there isn't actually really a meaningful economic trade-off. Like you can't build more homes, right? If you decide to build a triplex or a quadplex or a cottage cluster. And you have to also meet all these heightened kind of thresholds. Like you have to meet these heightened standards for review. You have all these different open space requirements, much higher off-street parking requirements, all these different things that kind of, when combined, you could pretty reasonably make the case that like you'd kind of have to hate money to build one of these housing types on land that's in these zones, right? It would always make more sense, or you could always make more money building something like a single detached dwelling unit or a duplex on a particular lot or parcel, right? So these are like important dynamics, right? That are kind of baked into the zoning code, but you wouldn't see that if you just looked at the allowed housing types. So with that in mind, we wanted to kind of open up a little bit of a conversation about the potential options that could be presented in the context of this particular barrier in the zoning code, right? There's a couple of examples that I kind of brainstormed. I'm not saying that any of these should be the particular policy that the city bakes up, but there's multiple ways that you could address this, right? You could incentivize the development of small detached dwellings, say, for example, detached plexes, or you could emphasize manufactured housing. You could, for example, if you want, allow triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters consistent with Division 46. That could be an example of an adoption-ready action that DLCD produces, just saying, hey, here you go. We've already baked this in a past process. Feel free to implement it if you want to emphasize that. You could also revise the multi-unit standards really to kind of make development more feasible, especially for smaller housing types, right? So you can kind of do a calibration there to make multi-unit development more feasible. And this is an example where the city did not have an HPS on deck, but they did have kind of an action plan that existed at the community level. So this could be a place where they could propose an alternative action. And in this case, they proposed having zoning map and regulatory revisions for essentially the cities inside of this county that create and or significantly expand mixed use zoning districts. This was like a recommendation sitting in a document that kind of hadn't been implemented. So this could be presented as an alternative to any of these particular options that are presented here. But I think what I wanted to open up a conversation for is just really quickly, like, let's talk about, all right, what should be the response to this kind of barrier and how should that function? And then let's have a conversation about the determination of whether it's within control of that city. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. I know I talked a lot there to kind of set up that context. Let's get into it.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
Anne.
So I'm thinking, and of course, I saw a lot of things that could be improved upon. So if DLCD makes specific recommendations for strategies, and then they propose something different, I don't know that what they proposed is actually going to work, but we don't have all the details about the mixed use zoning and those standards and the heights and lot coverage and parking and all that. But I guess I'm wondering how I guess there's some give and take going on, but would the city have to consider some of DLCD's recommendations? Based on their analysis of the code?
So pretty much what would happen is this barrier, right? This would be part of the audit that's published, right? And of course, it'd have a lot more context and detail around like what all is going into it, right? So it wouldn't just be a zoning code thing, but we had time to review their zoning code, right? So that's what we did. And what I kind of presented up, I was like, all right, well, there's multiple options. If your goal is small home production that can get you at this, here are a couple of options that could be considered. We can draw these from adoption ready actions that DLCD develops. Obviously, the city can propose their own. But pretty much what we do is we go into a housing acceleration agreement and we outline, all right, which one of these are we taking? What are the parameters? What are the specifics, right? And so that housing acceleration agreement, that's where we get into the like, all right, if we're going to do the mixed use zoning code, city, here's the parameters that make sense. Maybe this is the development density that we emphasize. Maybe it's this, like these parameters that we emphasize. That's where we actually get into a conversation with the city about, all right, how are we going to address this barrier? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I just, I'm just wondering if like what they propose back doesn't seem like enough to me for me. I mean,
Mhm.
not enough. So I mean, I'm kind of a hard line. And we only have 5.5 planners for a city of 58,000.
Right.
So I feel like they have plenty of planners. So
Yeah, and this is, I mean, Sean gestured at this, but just to really put a fine point on it, the DLCD and the city, this is where in the acceleration agreement you kind of have to negotiate to make sure that that the need is really being addressed, that the barrier is being directly addressed, and the city is welcome to, provide some alternatives. DLCD is not required to choose that as the path in the acceleration agreement. Ideally, there's a place to come to, like, an agreement that can be reached that's sort of like mutually agreeable. But the action needs to be sufficient for sure.
Yeah, essentially what the rule says is like the city can propose options, but they have to demonstrate that it's going to be meaningfully contributing to the barrier, right? So that's where kind of that discretion, that negotiation comes in. It's like, all right, if this is the action, how are we going to make sure that it's actually effective, right? That's where that conversation comes in on like, well, what are the precise parameters around this mixed use zoning district? And how are we going to make sure that it actually achieves the objective?
yeah, I mean, and that's the part that we don't know about. But I mean, just that one response back to me, I would definitely be like, okay, well, yeah, exactly what you just said, Sean. And like, how's this going to work? What uses are going to be allowed? What are the heights? And do you require, all that stuff. I'm just asking questions. I mean, I think that so far this is a great example. Just curious what the outcome was, or yeah.
And there is, that we don't have a proposed, like this isn't an actual audit or anything like that. We're just saying like this is a real problem. And so if we were in an audit process, what should it look like? What should be the outcome be, right?
So Sean, maybe we go through those analytical steps. Oh, go ahead, Michael.
I don't necessarily mean to derail your idea of cadence, but I wasn't clear on why the goal is smaller homes in this audit. The city identified that problem, and it may be true, but that's not one of the ONA like keystones, right? It's not total production, it's not affordable production, and it's, as far as I know, not any of the equity outcomes directly.
But it contributes, right?
It contributes. Oh, sure.
You're right. It is definitely, yeah. It's a form of underproduction. And I think the reason we chose it is we were trying to choose problems that the cities also identified. I mean, you'll see that in other places, like all the examples that we chose, these are like documented problems, right? Because obviously, if we're doing an audit, we're doing a fresh look at everything in the city. We're probably going to identify more than just like a particular, one particular problem that can be fixed with some code amendments. It's going to be more complex than that. We chose these because like we knew that these were problems that were documented by the city themselves. And so we at least know that they're almost certainly problems.
Right. Sure. And then the implication being that because the city has identified this as a problem, then it's more likely to be part of solving the goals of ONA, which I mentioned.
Well,
is that right?
No, more just it makes for an easy example, right?
Okay. I mean, to my mind, ONA should be about ONA. ONA shouldn't be about whatever other random problems the city identifies, right? And so why is the audit focused on these other issues?
So sorry, we're not saying that the audit is like focused specifically on the problems that the city identifies. That's not what we're trying to say.
Okay, sorry.
What we did is for the purposes of this exercise, we needed to find real problems. The
Sure.
easiest way to do that was to like look at things that we already know are problems. That's why we chose these.
Okay.
And
It has
denying
nothing to
those are
do with the
problems.
rule. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
And also, Michael, when the barriers are identified going forward, it's not just going to be you didn't produce enough units or you
Right.
didn't produce enough affordable units. There will be more granularity to those
Right.
barriers, and they'll likely over time reflect the fair housing issue areas, right? The sort of the data-driven examples of where cities need to be moving and making progress. And so there may be more interesting parity in some of those audit barriers reflective of things that they knew were already going to be difficult that they were going to be trying to mitigate. So I think this is actually is a good example, and maybe there would be context of small homes tend to be more affordable. We need to have better density so that we can get more supply. There may be sort of more causal underpinnings for why this is a barrier that needs to be addressed. But you know, this is just an exemplar for the moment.
Okay, I guess it totally makes sense to me why this problem would lead to underproduction, specifically of lower cost homes. I'm just thinking that, like, in terms of what the system's remedy is, I would want it to be more predictable, if possible, than whatever the DLCD staffer extracts from that table. Like, the city should ideally know in advance what it's likely to be told when the state pulls up that table and looks at it.
How would you
guess I would
propose
think.
doing that?
Yeah, I
How
would
would we know?
propose.
How would,
I
because
mean, you
like we're
made a
not going to
table,
know
right?
until the
You made a
audit's published.
simple
Yeah.
table summarizing the key components of the code that the city has for each of those land uses, right? And so if the state has a table that says the number has to be this big, at least this big, or at least this small, then that would be a way to do that, right?
Well, I mean, so with each one of those, so like when we had the barrier in the table, that was just a summary to say like, all right, what can we learn by looking at their zoning code? It's a simplification. There's more to their zoning code than that.
Of course.
Where I think you can start to have some like, hey, the state has this thing, and like this is where you can get some reasonable standards for this particular housing type or that kind of thing. That's where the adoption ready actions come in, right? So like when we present options to the city, we say, hey, DLCD has baked up 3 options for you. One is a policy around maybe incentivizing small detached dwellings that you can achieve by allowing detached plexes, or doing these changes to allow manufactured housing and prefabricated housing to your code. You could just legalize middle housing pursuant to Division 46. That should be an adoption ready action, right? And all the parameters of that are very clear. We could develop a series of multi-unit standard best practices as part of the adoption ready actions. And we like provide these, like these are clear things that particular city can do that are provide a lot of that consistent parameters that could be incorporated right into that actual audit process. And I think there's a lot of flexibility that comes from that. But like just having a table saying like this is what all codes should be or look like, I don't know how we would like operationalize that, but I'm open to ideas or discussion on that. Yeah, Thea.
Yeah, I was just thinking that what you brought up, Michael, points to something that I think we haven't really talked about, which is this, there is a startup phase of this program. There's, each city is unique, but there are probably going to be a certain set of barriers that are pretty common. And the further we get along with this program, sort of the more dialed in those responses will be, the sort of more predictable the solutions will be. And those can probably live in these adoption ready policies, but also, it will be less reliant on sort of this, really like qualitative research that, a DLCD has to do to, like sort this all out. It will become kind of more standardized just by nature of repetition and developing out kind of a set of responses. At least that's what I see as just sort of a natural effect of the program going forward.
I guess I would propose that the discretion of future DLCD staff would be well used in saying, is this local policy truly equivalent to this state-defined adoption-ready action? And less in choosing which adoption-ready action is needed in this case, right? Is that operable.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, so you can get to the point where a zillion courtyard requirements essentially mean that you haven't actually legalized a cottage cluster, right? Even though every other line in that little table would suggest that you had. And so that would be a case where somebody's discretion is necessary to be like, well, this fits the table, but it doesn't fit the spirit of the table. But like, if the maximum density for a fourplex is lower than the maximum density for a duplex, then that should just be automatic. That shouldn't require anybody's judgment to say that that's the wrong direction, I guess.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is, right, Division 46 says that, right? And so if that's presented saying like, here's a clear option that you can take if the outcome is to increase production of these types of units. And here it has all the parameters around, here's the allowed densities, here's the allowed courtyard requirements, the design standards. It's all baked, right? And pretty, relatively little discretion in terms of how it applies. And I mean, I think that kind of gets at that issue, does it not?
Maybe I don't. I certainly don't know the rule as well as you do. So maybe
the way
I'm
the rules
misinterpreting
work
what
is that like we define the parameters of unreasonable cost or delay and give cities certainty to say this is how you legalize middle housing in a way that doesn't cause unreasonable cost or delay, right? Because it doesn't include the poison pills.
Right. Yeah, and if that can be defined in this process, that's great. For the other uses that you'll be looking at.
Yeah, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like a good way to go for me in this case. And I think that we're going to have some really good examples once Tillamook is all, going off of those large city standards as far as middle housing. I think that maybe that's, in my experience dealing with a lot of smaller, medium-sized cities, examples go a long way into they want to see that something has actually worked in a place before they take the plunge themselves. So that seems entirely reasonable to me.
Go ahead,
Please,
Anna.
Ann. Yeah.
So I was thinking about, I mean, they need multifamily and multi-dwelling unit development and the standards. I mean, if there's sort of some general rules of thumbs for standards that can be obstacles to that, like lot coverage, height, parking, the required, open space and amenities. I don't know, if DLCD will, I mean, this will become more formulaic as you have responses, but for certain size cities, I mean, what are the concerns within the city? Has the city talked to developers? I mean, have they proposed development and it just won't pencil? I mean, requiring them to find out maybe what some of the specific obstacles are. Available land, does it have a bunch of wetlands on it? I don't know. I mean, the buildable land, I assume went through buildable lands inventory, but we still allow wetlands to be on those. And yeah, I mean, some things those are the obvious things that I would want to see in a table is, a little more detail, but I know you're just doing this as an exercise and, how willing is the city to explore ideas and find out really why things aren't happening if they think that they have enough land or whatever zone to allow for different uses? Have they actually talked to people that have tried to do this? And, but I do think some specific good rules of thumbs or models, and then what does density look like at 25 units an acre or whatever the increment is that really you need to do to make it pencil for a developer, the height and the density. So
Yeah, and I feel like an audit would dive into a lot more than just a zoning code, right? Because like we would want to understand, right, what are the development constraints that might not be captured on a BLI, or like what is the development community saying about development in this particular city, right? We would want to understand all of those things. That's good feedback though. Yeah. Yeah, Sam, and then why don't we open it up? I kind of want to hear from some other like Karen, Gus, if you guys have thoughts on this. Giovanni, I know you're stepping in, but feel free to chime in too. But yeah, please, Sam.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify. So the 3 and 4 plexes, they're essentially competing for the same land as the multifamily. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And so I think that's that's never a good situation that's not a good situation for multifamily or for large plexes in my opinion. And so definitely shifting the larger middle housing to single family lots would be the preferred outcome, so that we're not taking area away from potential multifamily development. For a real world example, since I'm not in DLCD, I don't have a problem naming specific examples. I know Hood River has said that their multifamily, that the main development in their multifamily area has been triplexes, and I think that that's a major problem for taking away potential denser, more affordable unit types. Even if in general I'm supportive of triplexes, I want to make sure that those are going in the correct place. And so I think that DLCD's approach should be to not just find ways to incentivize triplexes or quadplexes, but to do it in the right areas that doesn't take away from other housing opportunities.
I have a question that might be that's just kind of a follow-up to that, which is like, if we're doing an adoption ready action, that I feel like that doing that requires a lot of context, right? Which means it's discretionary, right? And so how do you introduce certainty and predictability in a way that also balances that kind of context or discretionary aspect? That's a problem that I think maybe I would love thoughts on. Yeah, Gus.
Thanks. I like the conversation. I think it's on track with where the small cities need to be. The example you used to me is ominous. The underproduction in the areas we're talking about is ominous. And I've said that before, that it's really trying to force feed ways that we can start to catch up on that, because every year that goes by is another underproduction. And so how do we do that? And that's what we're talking about. But I think one of the things that I noticed in the example is that the small communities need to find a way to incentivize production. So to me, that's almost one of the top examples. So what can we do? And going into that and delineating out really some ideas that have worked in that, even before the stage of enforcement, right? Here's some examples where we need to be considering these now and not in the enforcement stage. But speaking as a developer in a rural community, it's very we're very I don't want to call us one-dimensional, because I don't really view us as being one-dimensional, but our abilities are limited, and so we really need specific ways that we can function successfully. One of them is financing. So to me, if the cities could access financing from the state, and then the cities could make that process really simple for the developers to get that are willing to work in rural communities, because otherwise we're asking certain large developers to come into rural communities and we'll run out of capacity quickly, right? So we need to really be harnessing the workforce that we have in the small communities. And a lot of us don't have, we barely have bookkeepers, let alone, staff to do this stuff. So how do we harness that and make it super easy for just kind of the smaller guys to come in and build duplexes or the cottage clusters like we're doing? There's just a lot of opportunity in that. But even in my city here in LeGrand, I haven't really seen our city be super proactive with that process. They're being very open-minded to it all, but we're not really, there's not these wonderful ideas that I just can't pass up, right? So
yeah,
just some thoughts.
Yeah, so it's like open-minded, but it's not getting to that next step of okay, we're going to do something, right? And here's what that is. Here's what that plan is. Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's really good feedback. I feel like thinking about like this audit process and just going, going through and trying to think about options in this context, right? I know that this particular city, they don't have the same development pressure that say, maybe a community adjacent to Metro would have, where they have maybe very strong population growth. They have like easier access to like labor to build housing, that kind of thing. So it's going to be difficult, right, to build more housing in this particular community. And something I think that's also true is that they probably most of their development that happens there are by small scale builders, right? Who for a long time, like they're specialized in building certain types of housing, right? Especially detached single unit dwellings, right? So if the goal is making increasing production, especially of these units that are smaller, right? It might not make sense, and maybe it's an option to like consider making multi-unit development more feasible, but at the same time, like that's not going to change some of the other underlying dynamics of like, well, your developers probably don't even know how to build multi-unit housing, right? Like that's a whole specialized skill set. But instead, maybe it does make sense to focus on the things that you do have that specialized expertise for. Maybe for small homeowners, adding in manufactured housing could be very effective. Building in detached plexes or cottage clusters, right? Like builders know how to build those, right? Because they're just detached single units, right? Just in a smaller format. And maybe emphasizing those things and having the options to consider those things is like a better use of time to get at the outcome rather than trying to, prescribe a particular policy solution to a problem. That's something that I think I took away from this. I'm kind of interested what y'all think about that too, or that idea. It's like the short of what I said is like essentially like there's more than one way to pet a cat or to solve a particular problem. Yeah, and
Well, I agree. There's density can come in a lot of forms. And so, depending on what the capacity is of your small community, I mean, you can build a lot of detached houses or plexes or whatever and achieve a 12 to 15 unit per acre. And I mean, what we didn't see from this example either was what was their past building or what was the past, development pattern in a community, and how do you just take maybe the same types of buildings and figure out what a minimum density threshold is to try to meet some of your needs and to reduce, affordable or whatever. I mean, I do think that's a good approach. And then, I mean, there's tips for success, especially for smaller cities that don't maybe have a lot of planning staff, like the model code for small cities is being redone. Other cities, small cities codes that maybe have gone through an HPS process and have had similar issues come up, and strategies, and how do they address the proposed strategy, in the matrix. And I don't know, just you want them to be successful and have sort of a menu of things to look at, and try to achieve a minimum density in certain zones, but don't be so specific about the type of housing. I don't know. I
or
like
just
that.
like thinking about it in terms of framing options. It might not always just be like it might not be a zoning code issue even, right? Could be a bunch of different things. And actually, with that in mind, why don't we pivot to talking about infrastructure? Unless does anybody have kind of last parting thoughts on this? Yeah, Cadence.
Sean, before we move on, I would like us to spend just a minute talking about the three components about is it in a city's control, right? And so I think changing zoning code is physically within a city's control, right? So there are actions the city can take. And then the next piece is it reasonably within their control, given the capacity with some support from DLCD? And so can we talk a little bit about what that might look like?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mentioned, right, we don't have all the information, but we do know roughly that they have about 5 FTE, which, for a city their size is maybe a little bit more than average, but also certainly not like a full blown like large city planning staff or anything like that, right? So still pretty limited. But yeah, no, let's talk about that intersection. So the next two parts of the test are like, is that reasonable enough to do like a code amendment project? And then DLCD funding and support, right, needs to be provided for it to meet those other two parts of the test. So let's talk about how that should play out.
think they should be able to make changes? Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, again, with if the solution is adopt Division 46, then yeah, it seems like funding should not be a significant issue in terms of working it into the existing code. Time as a resource is less of a concern. I think generally speaking, yes, these are issues that are within the city's control, and there should not be major barriers. Politically, there might be major barriers, but in terms of city resources, I don't think that there's barriers.
Thoughts from others? This one's kind of more straightforward. Yeah, Anne.
Well, I mean, I think if there is a model code out there for, the housing types or the city sizes or whatever, it's easy to evaluate language and just tweak it a little bit. I mean, you don't need a consultant for that. So I feel like cities should be able to do that. You don't always need a consultant for the strategy implementation or to update your code. You need a consultant to do your housing needs analysis, but you don't need one for changing your code, in my opinion, especially if you have good model codes out there to look at. So
Don't tell the consultants.
We'll have
all right.
plenty of work for them. Cadence. Okay, should we?
Yeah, I just don't think, I mean, we have literally 4 current planners and 1.5 long range planners. And, I mean, if you probably don't have that many building permits coming in, if you have 5 planners, I mean, whatever the number is, I just feel like, and maybe they can demonstrate that, no, we don't have enough people on staff to take and copy and paste model code language, I mean, it isn't quite as simple as that, but it can be, definitions, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And, also I think that DLCD funding side of it too is pretty important, right? Like let's say we're broke, right? That it doesn't meet that third part of the test, right? And it doesn't pass the threshold of being within the city's control. But if it is, then, potentially there's pathways to be like, all right, instead of 1.5, we'll provide funding to, maybe two FTE or something to kind of take on these code amendment projects. And here's what that looks like, that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, whatever that looks like, I guess there would be a degree of a discussion that needs to happen about like, what's that resource gap to get there? All right. Well, should we move to talking on the next issue?
Do it.
All right. Well, then I'll share my screen and I'll hand it over to Thea and Maddie.
Okay. So this is one that I think anybody in the housing space has heard. This is not a unique circumstance. I think it affects a lot of cities. For this exercise, we chose a real life but hypothetical case. This is a medium city, about 12,000 population, a little less than 5 FTE. So, not a insignificant planning staff. I think, we'll just jump into some of the background of this kind of barrier. It's not a hidden barrier, so there's like not that much detective work that DLCD needs to do to find it. I think any city that is facing some wastewater capacity issues will know that will come to the front, come to the top really sort of right away. But cities feel really hamstrung in the face of these kinds of public facilities issues, and this often comes up as an example of this is not within our control. What how as a city do I I can't build more units we are, you know, under a moratorium. DEQ has, you know, DEQ has limited our connections. So we wanted to sort of dig in, look under the hood a little bit, and figure out what kind of paths there were within those constraints. First, a little bit about DEQ's process, and I just got this from Maddie because I haven't dug into this much myself, but Maddie is the professional. So Maddie, if you have anything to add here, please jump in. I'm just going to go through sort of high level. So DEQ permits the wastewater facility every roughly 10 years, I think. They monitor the contaminant load of the effluent. So if you're near the limit, the agency will prescribe a set contaminant load that the city has to reach to lower their contaminant load, and develop an agreement with the city as to how they'll meet that. So a set of actions, a work plan, resources, they lay that all out. So as part of that work plan, DEQ, the leverage DEQ has with the city is a limitation on the number of mainline connections, to that mainline sewer. That serves as kind of a consequence in order to get the city to respond. And so let's say this is happening in our hypothetical city. DEQ has limited the number of connections that they're allowed to have. So in this scenario, the city is at the midpoint of their HPS cycle. They're among the lowest producers among their peers in region. And DLCD finds that the audit finds that they're particularly falling behind in multifamily production. They've specifically limited this type of development because the city has a perception that the more units equals the more connections. That's a kind of, I take it, a common way to look at it. So they are feeling stuck. Maddie, am I characterizing that all relatively appropriately?
Yeah, and I apologize if I just step back 1 second and introduce myself. I'm Madeline Phillips, and I worked as a local planner for about 10 years before I came to DLCD, and I've only been at DLCD for a couple of years, so I'm still pretty fresh in the local government world. And I worked for a city who had this problem on the horizon. It had not yet reached the capacity, but it was a known factor. And yes, Thea, you characterized a lot of that correctly, that cities typically wait until their permitting process requirement kicks in, or until they reach a timeline threshold in which DEQ will respond with a set of criteria that a city has to meet. And so this challenge related to service options is somewhat known, but it's not the extent of which it might limit a city's potential development is not very well known. So until the DEQ response to a permit renewal request is initiated, there's not a whole lot that's known that can be anticipated in a way that mitigates the barrier before it's present. I just want to make that pretty clear, because it's not something that a city 5 years in advance can say, well, we know that the treatment threshold will be X. We'll make this investment ahead of time. A lot of cities will wait for that mandate from DEQ, and that's a pretty common practice. So to that end, I think there are a lot of nuances to it, and I won't get into the details, but I'm pretty well familiar with some of them. I'll do my best to answer some of those questions as they come up.
Thanks, Maddie. That's super, super helpful context. So we can go to the next slide, Sean. So we were thinking through different ways that DLCD and the city could approach this. There are clearly many elements that are outside of a city's control here. And one path that DLCD has is to work with other agencies to identify paths forward. So I in these two columns sort of outlined some things that a city can do, some things that DLCD can do, along with other state agencies. So let's talk through some of the work that DLCD can do with DEQ to help address this. And I think that part of what we want to illustrate here is that there does not have to be like one solution to a barrier. Like you can put together a package of solutions. There are things that a city can do that support the work that DLCD and the other agencies can do, and vice versa. So I'll need your help here, Maddie. DLCD can work with DEQ, you know, help the city meet with them, or just meet with them ourselves to start to understand how much flexibility there is in the sort of capping metrics, in how DEQ is actually measuring that contaminant load. It turns out that a lot of their approach is less than scientific, I'll say, and not in administrative rule. It is simply, you know, their sort of received wisdom and common practice. And so there are opportunities here to think about what that sort of common practice that they've relied on for a long time is actually incentivizing. So if they're measuring, you know, each unit as a connection, that incentivizes bigger units and fewer connections. Can DLCD work with DEQ to sort of redefine that measurement? So, you know, an example is maybe total effluent flow rather than number of units. I think another one is what kinds of connections are we talking about? Is it possible that a multi-unit structure can have a single unit option, a single connection option, rather than each unit having its own connection? So rather than 20 connections, a multi-unit development can have a single connection. Maddie, do you want to provide any context there, or is that kind of just general big picture?
Pretty sufficient, Thea, but I would just add, this is something that I'm working with. I'm also, what I failed to mention is that I'm the public facilities planner within the housing division. And my qualification for that is only the local government experience that I had before. And I'm not an engineer or anything like that by trade. So forgive the generalities that I might present. But what I have been working with DEQ on is understanding the cause and effect of some of their general practice when they do a memo of agreement, for example, that Thea mentioned, of how a city will mitigate exceeding a permit threshold or requirement. There are land use outcomes and implications such that there are some development types that are disincentivized by the way that they effectuate that agreement. And then there are ways that DEQ might work with a city and with DLCD as a facilitator or convener to focus on what are the ways that a city could meet compliance and see the types of development that they wish, that we all wish would come to pass. And I think it's safe to say that, especially given the small housing example that was presented just before this, there are limitations when cities use a pretty common public works design standard practice of each unit having its own connection, a city might run into a barrier at the point of this memo of agreement saying we these smaller unit developments anymore because it consumes all of our annual allowed connections. And that's not, from my understanding, that's not the intent of DEQ. It's more of an awareness factor of how do we motivate the city to consider the steps it will have to take and move through a set, not dissimilar from an acceleration agreement, and move through the steps that it might take to mitigate a challenge. However, those issues are really focused on scientific criteria. Are you loading the river with too many pollutants? And they're not necessarily considering what the land use outcomes are of the way that they limit that. So there might be some ways that DLCD as an actor, as a convener, could bring that to light and maybe cite or highlight the types of housing that are needed and prioritize those, for example, and think about the ways that that prioritization could be effectuated through a way to mitigate connections or a way to mitigate the proliferation of certain types of housing that might not necessarily be ideal in the landscape.
Awesome, Maddie. Thank you. I think there's, you know, there were some elements in the city column that you all got to see. There's nothing, you know, I think we don't need to spend too much time going through those because I really do want to pivot this back to a discussion here with you all. But what I just wanted to highlight is that we have, you know, these multiple tools in the toolbox. This, you know, the city brings some, DLCD brings some, and we can bring in other parties that are involved. So I guess with that, I'd love to open up a conversation here about this approach, this example, and you know, I'd love to hear from cities about about like whether this is this seems like a viable way to approach something like this, and also from everybody else about if anything is missing and falling through the cracks in something, you know, in this type of approach to a barrier like this.
Yeah, and Thea, if I'll just add, like in the context of the acceleration program, right, this is a situation where there's like, oh, there's more than just like, oh, this is clearly all within the city's control. There's a state regulatory body that influences this. So let's talk about like, all right, now we're in a situation that's more gray area. How should this play out in terms of, all right, the audit identifies this barriers. What are we going to do in response to it? So let's talk through that. That would be something we would really like to know.
To put a finer point on it, should we only be hassling DEQ, or so should the cities also be required to do something for this specific barrier, even though they're not the sole responsible party for creating the barrier or mitigating it? And
Well, I mean, I think if sewer issues, it's not just unique to residential. I mean, I think a city needs to plan ahead, and I mean, and that's Public Works Department, right? And city council and facility planning and all that. I feel like, I mean, I'm not as familiar with the small cities and their systems and DEQ regulations, but you know, a city needs to start planning ahead for their facilities. And when you do the housing needs analysis, you know, they should be looking at your facility plans for capacity, and maybe there's a recommendation in there, and that there should be some conversations between the planning department and public works department, because, and the council, like, hey, we aren't going to be able to grow if we don't start planning ahead to address our sewer. And this isn't just with houses, this is with jobs and restaurants or whatever. I don't know. I feel like the city has a responsibility to plan for its facility planning to accommodate 20-year growth projections. Otherwise, it's like a self-made moratorium, which maybe politically they want, but I don't think that's right.
And sorry, I just wanted to jump in ahead of this conversation that looks like it's starting, because I think there is another element that we didn't totally talk about, which is, does DLCD have a role in sort of mediation within, you know, and between city departments? You know, is there sort of that kind of level of intervention, I guess, with DLCD at the city level? Or, Anne, do you think that's just, you know, the city needs to work that out on their own?
Well, I mean, I think there needs to be that discussion, right? I mean, I hope it's great that you guys were talking to DEQ about some of these issues, but I mean, I think there's still a problem, a long range or even a short, medium term problem that they may not be able to grow at all as a city in any way, shape, or form, if they have sewer issues or water issues or whatever it is. So I feel like this needs to be flagged and like planning department needs to talk to the public works department or have some knowledge. And sometimes smaller cities, either they all work together because everybody, you know, like is in the same room, I don't know, or you're just super isolated and you're not constantly working with your folks. I mean, when we have pre-app meetings, we always have public works staff in the room. And so they're, you know, you should know that, woo, we've got some issues going on in public works, and it's really a council decision. So
Samuel.
Good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's maybe the opportunity for a new formula to be worked out when it comes to those efficiencies. How much does a new unit represent compared to an old unit? Figuring out what that ratio is, that would be acceptable to DEQ. That I think probably, Thea, to your point, maybe is that is going to take some coordination between like local building codes and planning. It would also probably take some possibly some changes to the development code in the city to bump up those efficiencies even further in new construction. Yeah, I think that there's a lot more that we could be getting out of the existing system, but we need some kind of rational basis for it, just like with all of our land use decisions.
Karen.
So first, I would just want to thank you guys for the work on all of this. And for Clackamas County, we don't necessarily fit into the same structure. So I try not to comment too much because it might not be directly relevant from our own experience. But I did feel like it was important to highlight how it will make in these unincorporated areas that may have different sewer districts and different spaces, there's going to be different sets of solutions. And it will, so for Washington County and Clackamas County, in those unincorporated areas, it will be doing like several of these, audits, right? Because the areas are so different. And so it's not as simple as saying, oh, here, there's a sewer problem. There might be a sewer problem here in Oak Grove, but maybe there's not one over outside of Happy Valley, or, in this other area that will eventually be served by certain areas. So it's really challenging to understand the full applicability. But so I think that's one thing. And as they are moving forward with the, even the acceleration program and how it fits into these unincorporated areas, right? That don't have the same firm boundaries, that have perhaps unclear targeted areas. There's so much that that still needs to be worked out. So I don't know how we end up kind of having that conversation. And maybe there's even the fourth example of unincorporated areas, but it's so minor compared to the rest of the state, because the rest of the state typically falls into, oh, hey, I'm in a city. So.
Yeah, and this one is definitely simplified because the city example that we're pulling from, they are the administrator of the wastewater program, right? But yeah, Maddie, I see you got off mute too.
Thanks, Sean. But it does, Karen, you bring up a great point and a point that will likely be common after several, this first round, perhaps even several additional rounds of the ONA program, that unincorporated places will have pressure on them, regardless of the targets that are associated, and perhaps as a result of some work that ONA does and the applicability of the ONA targets to counties, that counties now are likely to, because of some of the comments, for example, that folks from Washington County offered at our recent RAC meeting, that saying, you know, your county area is shrinking based on cities using land that you have to accommodate the growth that they will need. And you still have some target responsibility, or at least some allocation that will be expected, that will be the county's responsibility. And it might prompt a lot of conversation between sewer districts and unincorporated places, and how they might be able to accommodate the need that counties are responsible for. And what I know at a very cursory level is that there isn't, where there doesn't need to be a relationship yet, there isn't one. And so those will be new relationships. Getting back to the city context of having to coordinate between public works and planning departments, I know for certain that there are a number. So for example, many of those cities that are curtailed or have a de facto moratorium, they do coordination work between public works and planning. The challenge is that the public works department often is focused on maintenance and operations issues, and the planning department is focused on expansion, growth, and perhaps even efficiency measures. And the question is, at what point does the city influence the balance of how much efficiency is pushed into places in the city that maybe don't have serviceability or don't have capacity because of existing infrastructure limitations, versus external pressure to grow or to build new. And one of the minutiae of that example is that a lot of times DEQ will allow cities to continue to connect to existing mainline, but they won't allow additional mainline extensions. So this has an effect on the development pattern, as you might imagine, of the types of housing that are available to developers, in that, for example, one is not able to build a single family or single unit detached housing development where the units are fee simple anymore, but rather are obligated to build, or can only build, those types of units that have shared connections or are owned in their entirety. So these are unintended consequences of some decisions that are made not only by the city, but also by a state agency. And they have maybe some perverse incentives that are built into them. So it was just an example of a city. It's not the first, and it likely will not be the last in the next 5 to 10 years, who will run into this problem. So I appreciate you thinking through how the acceleration program can corral that.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Maddie, for providing all that background and for being our coordination with these other agencies that are working in public facilities realm. I think we should pivot now to the last barrier, unless, oh yeah, Sean.
Similar to last time, let's do that exercise again, where with the determination of local control or not. The last example is easy. This one's harder, right? So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, good call, Sean.
Right. So remember the 3-part test, right? Locally actionable, which question mark, right? Reasonable city capacity. In this case, I don't think we have that much information on it, do we, Thea?
Yeah, I don't think so. Although they have 4.5 planning staff for a 12K city.
Yeah. And of course, also there'd be consideration of public works staff in here too, which we don't have that information, at least on top of our, on the top of our domes. And then finally, DLCD funding, right? And of course, we're obviously not going to have the funding to replace an entire wastewater system. But let's talk about that with these kind of more challenging dynamics.
Sam.
I think that there's maybe sub barriers where that are more in cities' control, that they could be maybe more responsible for. The thing that comes to mind is, and thankfully it ended up not actually being an issue in the end, but I can't remember if it was RIP 1 or RIP 2, but there was a last minute proposal to individually meter units in middle housing. And thankfully that did not happen, but there was the concern that that would be unreasonable cost or delay. If that had happened, I would say that's obviously something that's within a city's control to, in terms of utilities. And maybe there's some examples within this one of aspects of it that are more in a city's control that they should be responsible for.
Yeah, so it's not so much like a flat determination of like this is or isn't, like it's a binary, but it's more like these components that are related to DEQ that might be related to a special district, this type of thing. That's outside of the city's control. It's not locally actionable. Yeah. But if there are, say, public facility standards that contribute to this, right, and they can be changed, and we have the funding to do it and the capacity to do it, then that might be something that does.
Go ahead,
Michael.
As with the last example, it seems like there are some things that you could define objectively. You could say, how do your rates compare to the rates in other cities? When was the last time you raised your rates? And then, there are other things that are not objectively definable.
Totally. I think it's useful to think of, these multiple strands that, can weave together into a braid, but that this one has different, can trace the barrier to different places. And I think this sort of just demonstrates, because this is a very significant barrier, kind of the work that DLCD will do to follow those strands.
Anne.
Well, I do think this is with a big cost dollar. I mean, the city can't fix this immediately. But they should be able to plan, and maybe be required to plan. And can you determine areas that do have sewer capacity? I mean, we have a whole area that needs a whole basin that has to have a whole new thing. Well, we asked for money, in this last legislative session, and we got some. I mean, boy, we needed it for a whole bunch of other things, but we're prioritizing that towards, helping us get through the phases of this huge sewer project. But I mean, I do think in the housing needs analysis, you really have to identify these things there. And then that kind of flows to whether you actually have available land, and you can start before you're 3 years into your HPS, you could have identified something in your housing needs analysis, and this would have been flagged a little earlier that these could be issues with sewer capacity. I mean, that would ideally be the case, so that this isn't like a surprise during an audit process or, the housing acceleration program. So you would think that there would be, well, what do we do because we have this issue and DLCD could help? I mean, DLCD can't fund these kinds of projects, but, maybe if there's priorities for how the state allocates funding related to housing, infrastructure is such a huge cost and barrier to housing. So.
Gust.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with Anne on those items where there should be some type of a metric where all cities that we're talking about, the size of the cities we're talking about, could identify with where that demand becomes a plannable process. So at what percentage does the state dictate your inventoriable land is not, or your buildable land is not sufficient to not have a plan to start moving forward with this. So that to me seems like a real measurable concept. It does seem like I know, for instance, like if my wife says we need to take the trash out, and I'm thinking, well, okay, but I got 2 trash cans, so I can just put more trash into that trash can, and then I'll take it all at once. You know, that example, that doesn't really exist in this setting because we can't catch up, right? I can catch up in one day. I just take all the trash in one day. Well, the cities can't. And what I noticed is we had this situation in LeGrand where I was trying to develop a piece of ground that needed this exact thing. They needed to have a lift station built and needed incorporated into the sewer. And but it was arduous, right? The task was arduous, and the city had a lot to do. And so it's easy to just push it off. Well, if there's just a number that they have to abide by, I think, where we have to incorporate this now, not just because this guy wants us to, we really need to. To me, that's different for every city. And so if the state mandates it, if the state mandates that I have to take the trash out, I'm going to do it. But if it's just up to me to, I'll wait till tomorrow to do it, I'm probably going to wait because it's easier. You know, I'm not trying to diminish the public works departments or whatever, but it's just a lot of work for them to do it. And so I think we're at the point where we have to kind of start holding people's feet to the fire to make things happen.
That's great. I mean, to both of your guys' points, I think this has good implications both for like the acceleration program being focused on not just like, all right, you know, you have this big backlog of, you know, tens of millions of dollars in deficit, but rather thinking about, all right, well, definitely things you can do include, you know, applying for different funding sources. DLCD can help you with that. And then also making sure in your future planning cycles, like building in this kind of better analysis of like, all right, where are we planning for like sewer capacity? What are we doing? How are we coordinating with public works? All that kind of stuff. And so I think it also has a nexus too with the development ready lands inventory. So, which, you know, I know Maddie's working on a bunch. So that's super helpful. All right. Should we move on now? Okay. We have one more. We only have 22 minutes left in our meeting today. So, but I will say this is an example of one that we wanted to speak to. It's on accessibility. And there's a couple of reasons that we chose it. We actually chose it because it's an example of a strategy that is it is a fair housing issue area, right? So like this is one of the things that in our HPSs, we're going to be focusing on accessible housing and planning for housing needs for people with disabilities. It is something that we don't have a lot of good information on, right? We don't have any accessibility data in relationship to like how many accessible units do we have? That's lacking statewide, right? We don't have that anywhere. It should improve over time, right? And the equity indicators that we have, they tell us part of the story, but they don't tell us the full story. And also our tools to address it are limited, right? It's because a lot of this deals with the building code, right? And the building code obviously preempts local codes, right? So there's the tools that you have are much more limited in terms of facilitating accessible housing, right? So it's these three it's kind of this trifecta of things that relate to a fair housing issue area, but the things around implementation or doing anything about it are really difficult. So I wanted to like dive into it. And I'll spend less time presenting this because there actually isn't that much to present. So let me share my screen really fast. I was hoping at a minimum by this point that I would have, so, you know, OHCS, they're working on housing equity indicators, right? Like they're going to publish this dashboard where every city you can see like, here are our equity indicators. I had wanted to try to see like, is there a way I can get a screenshot to illustrate this for the group? But they still have to refine their data. They have to do a bunch of stuff to it and they don't feel comfortable sharing it, right? And I understand that. That makes a lot of sense, even though for my selfish planning needs, I want it. We kind of don't really need it, but I did want to present that like we will have some data around disability and housing options for people with disabilities. They're going to be imperfect, but there will be a degree, there'll be some insights that we can glean from it in terms of the information that's provided. Essentially, this list is like every you know, when the housing equity indicators are published, it will include all of this information as part of it that relate to housing needs for people with disabilities, right? So we'll have some information in relationship to this, but we're not going to have very perfect information. We're certainly not going to have accessible housing data. That's going to take time to build over time. There's going to need to be improvements in how we gather and collect data. Obviously, that's a long-term effort, right? But what we can say right now is we don't know a lot about it, but we know that pretty much in almost any community that it's going to be a pretty significant problem. And so I decided to look into a community. This is a larger city that actually does have an adopted housing production strategy. And this is one of the areas where they identified a shortage of accessible housing units. So I chose it because I was like, I don't have to do the analysis here. Their own analysis shows that accessible housing is an issue. Therefore, I can kind of steal it as an example for use in this exercise. Again, I'm not saying that that's how the audit works, right? The audit, we would do a much deeper dive. We would have all this equity indicator data that I don't have here today. So just keep that in mind. But again, right, with the context of this, we know it's an issue in this particular community. They've highlighted it themselves. This is probably going to be a barrier in most every city. We know accessible housing is in short supply everywhere, even with the poor information that we do have. But this is also an area where our options of actually addressing it are going to be limited because of the building code, right? Because there's this preemption on local governments setting accessibility standards in their own building codes, right? And really the tools that they have available to them are actions that they can take in respect to incentives. How can we incentivize accessible housing? Gather information on accessible housing units that we can report to the state to actually make progress on this particular issue. And this is one where, right, our options are limited. So if you look into the actual examples of policies that we could develop, well, one of them could be, right, we've definitely heard that accessible housing is a major priority and DLCD needs to develop an adoption ready action on it. So that absolutely could be one of these. We definitely want to develop one of those adoption ready actions. But this is a great example where a city has an adopted HPS, and in their HPS, they have a strategy set up. This is what you see on the right here. This is a screenshot from that city's HPS where they document. They're like, hey, one of our actions is going to be incentivizing the provision of accessible housing using a bunch of incentive programs, using a bunch of tools that are within our control to facilitate accessible housing. So based on our rules, because we consider what's in the city's adopted HPS, we could say, hey, city, your options include either this DLCD provided piece that we have available for you, or the thing that you wrote down in your HPS, right, which could be used as a way to address accessible housing, right? So I wanted to, kind of set that up. Again, the context here is much lighter because we don't have a lot of information on it, but I wanted to talk about this problem in particular and like how we grapple with these kind of stickier fair housing issues and how that can relate to cities' HPSs. How are we going to fix accessible housing, guys?
Go ahead, Gus.
Yeah, Gus.
I think incentivize it again. So as we create opportunities that we're talking about for developers and builders to have more interest in building, let's give them an additional incentive to consider building slab homes or whatever it might be for accessibility, and create some of those things that we don't typically want to do just because we can. So I think incentivizing it is one way.
Thank you. Tom.
That's awesome. And I could definitely affirm, I think one of the strongest places of agreement that everybody we've heard in the process so far is like getting an incentive program on accessible housing is something like everybody's like, yes, let's do this.
Tom, go ahead.
Tom.
Yeah, I agree with Gus. I think the easy first step is, as a local government, are you offering any sort of incentives, density bonuses or whatever to increase the number of required accessible units? I think where we need the state's help is working with BCD to free up local governments to require more accessible housing. I think we've reached a crisis level here. I think everybody is showing, with an aging population, we need to be able to require more of these accessible units, or change the definition of accessible units. And then related to that, I think also from the state, we need sort of, I guess, more technical assistance, like looking at what is that, what do we mean by accessible, and also programs to support retrofitting buildings, especially single family homes, with ramps and better bathrooms and that sort of thing, because we're not going to be able to build our way out of this to match the need. Unless 100% of the housing is accessible. I think this is one of those that there's a hidden underproduction element that we haven't looked at, that adds to the need, that we also need to look at what kind of technical assistance, tax credits, whatever, to encourage people to invest in existing structures with retrofits, similar to energy retrofit. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Sam?
Yeah, I'm all for incentives for getting accessibility in smaller structures. But I would say that the regulatory approach would be get more buildings that where those accessible units would be required by law anyway. So quadplexes and above. I mean, if the pressure point on the city is get more of your housing mix to be quadplexes and above, then you're going to get more accessible units, period. I'd say in addition to that, I like that cities have started to adopt some like ADU plans, basically adoption or pre-approved ADU plans. But what I saw from the ones that Eugene put out and then Portland and Bend adopted is that none of them were accessible. None of them were up to that FHAA requirement of accessibility. So I think that pre-approved plans are great, especially when it comes to those smaller units, but making sure that there's some minimum accessibility, even options in those, I think would be a really great and a good place for the state to show some leadership.
Right, awesome. Yeah, I think I'm hearing, so there's some interesting dynamics that are coming up. I think one is like broaden the set of actions to a broader set of, like, not just incentives, but like thinking about the like adoption, like, ready build plans that a lot of cities are pursuing, thinking about like retrofit options, things like that. And try to set all of that up and be more broad than just thinking about, all right, new production having some kind of incentive policy or something like that, which I think is very helpful. And I think also, obviously, we know that, like, and I think this is actually an interesting dynamic that we should talk about, which is, there are going to be times where we see like there's a state barrier problem here, right? And there can be times like we should meet with DEQ, right, to talk about like there's this wastewater facility problem. But we're going to run into situations where, like, what if it's the fire code? What if it's BCD? What if it's this? And like we're bumping up against other agencies and their missions. How should this process, like, we can meet with them for sure, but how should this process reconcile, identify, and grapple with those barriers? I think would be a great point of discussion if folks want to spend some time on that.
I think you're being too modest. I mean, I think your role is to elevate that to the governor's office, to the legislature, to say, here's the sticking point. We need a higher authority to convene some direction. I think the legislature tried with single staircase building and kind of got a wah on that issue. But I don't think we're not going to get there if DLCD just defers to other people's missions. And if we have a governor's office that housing production is a priority, then we need to elevate the conversation.
Are you saying we need to be the housing czar?
Someone needs to be the housing czar and needs to be aware of the issue and the barriers to solving the issue. Otherwise, okay, we offer a density bonus. We've done what we can. Maybe we get a grant occasionally for technical assistance or some cash incentives. And we did what we could, and that's what it is. And we're willing to accept the result.
He takes the housing czar's phone number.
Sam.
Yeah, I'll just add that on this issue specifically, like Fair Housing Amendments Act has this provision that says that it is recommended but not required that these be adopted into state and local building codes. And Oregon did not do that. And until you know, for a couple decades. And then as a result, we ended up probably losing out on generations of multifamily buildings that should have had accessible units and just didn't. And we have no way to make up for that. So it was the law, it was federal law, but the fact that the Oregon building codes did not formally adopt that into their into the building codes meant that we're way behind. I don't I'm not sure where the proxy of buildings after 1970 came from that you were using for the equity indicator, but I think it's much worse than that.
Yes, so it's a this is something that OHCS is trying to grapple with because we don't have any accessibility data, right? It's going to take time to build that in new permitting. And so they wanted to at least be able to like have some information on it, right? Or try to find proxies to have something that's better than nothing, right? So you know, I'll defer to OHCS on the specifics there. I know we have Brandon on the call, but yeah, that's my understanding of the intent.
I think one of the points that we've been playing around is there are lots of places where there are actions that cities can take to make improvements. And it looks like the acceleration agreements will be identifying those and requiring cities to make those improvements. And pretty soon, in a couple cycles, we're going to be hitting barriers that are really more in the state's control. And so as each audit and acceleration agreement starts to call those out, of course, DLCD will be taking proactive approach, or federal, absolutely, Sean. And it will likely inform sort of the messaging to the governor, the legislator, and the other sister agencies, to see what else can be done. Because after a while, there won't be so much. And by a while, I mean a couple decades, right? There won't be so much that cities can do. They will have done all of the things, and it will be time for more. And hopefully that will happen sooner rather than later.
And I'll just add, you know, obviously this is a deeper dynamic than like you can write in a law that makes sense. We did include a provision that was trying to say, hey, there's going to be state barriers that we identify, and we have regular reporting to LCDC. So at a minimum, we should make sure that when we identify state level barriers, that these are summarized, outlined, put in a document to LCDC, make sure it's still part of our collective consciousness, it's reported to leadership, all that kind of stuff. You know, I think it's harder to write like, and we will advocate to the, you know, like how do you write that in rules, especially things that exceed your statutory authority. But I think it's a good point. I think we all agree that like there needs to be a broader recognition and role for other state agencies to participate in the solution. But yeah, Anne.
I mean, I agree with everything everybody said, especially Tom. I mean, we had all those strategies in our HIP strategy, HIP implementation plan, but I mean, the cost of requiring an elevator, even if it's just in one of the 4 buildings, and kind of got pushed back, and we were going to we're going to provide our own requirement for accessibility. And then we found out the process to get approval with the state. I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. The only other thing is we are incentivizing 1-story houses, or, you know, small houses, and because they don't have to be 1-story, but I mean, at least a 1-story house. I mean, so it's not all in the multi-dwelling unit or the 4plexes and above. We are incentivizing and actually just changing our standards to make it easier to allow without any incentives smaller houses. So that might help with, you know, people that still want to be homeowners or live in a detached product or whatever. So it needs to be across the full spectrum, you know. But yeah, I mean, everything you guys said we're going to be trying to do, and but we only get so far, right, without changes at the state level.
Well, I am impressed with you people. We were able to get through all 3 sample barriers, and I'm very impressed with the flow of the conversation and the thoughts everybody had. Next time, we're going to be working through referral. And so that will be another chance for us to walk step by step through how a set of cities in their midpoint review would go from, not eligible to eligible to referred. And we'll step by step through that and see where there might be some hitches in our giddy up and where it might work pretty smoothly. And look forward to talking with you all then. Thea or Sean, are there any other thoughts before we close for the day?
No, just a lot of appreciation for going through this exercise with us. I think we got so much out of this. I want to do this with every barrier, just like get you guys as a panel. So, if you get a call from me, no, but it's actually really, really great to have a lot of brains on this. And I think it's, this is kind of what we're going to, similar to some of the work that we will be starting to do in the next year, in the coming year. So stay tuned for more information about that.
All right, folks. Hope y'all have a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye.